Have you heard the news that's going around here? The man in charge has got to go, 'cause he dances around the problem, boy. And the problem is the man in charge, you know. Now the young knows what I'm talking about. It's a con in the old man's game. The man in charge, he don't know what he's doing. He don't know the world has changed.
Geopolitics is the study of the effects of Earth's geography, both human and physical, on politics and international relations. According to John Agnew, professor of geography at UCLA, quote, geopolitics has long been used to refer to the study of the geographical representations, rhetoric, and practices that underpin world politics. The word has in fact undergone something of a revival in recent years. The term is now used freely to refer to such phenomena as international boundary disputes, the structure of global finance, and geographical patterns of election results. The term geopolitics came into use at the end of the 19th century. Thinking globally was, at the time, formally connected by geopolitical reason to acting globally. But the actual practice of geopolitics began much earlier, when Europeans first encountered the rest of the world. Several general theories emerged during the early history of geopolitics. For Alfred T. Mahan, the key to global power lay in access to and command of the seas, a key that carried with it revolutionary shifts in the naval strategy of nearly every maritime power. For Ellsworth Huntington, the important variable was climate. He argued that certain climates were responsible for technological inequalities across the globe, of which made Europeans more intellectual than people located in the tropics. Huntington's hypotheses resulted in the rationalization of imperialism in Africa and led to the growth of social Darwinism as a dominant philosophy in Western Europe. More than any other scholar, however, it was Sir Halford Mackinder who proposed what would become the most widely discussed concept of geopolitical studies. In this, he argued that control of resources, especially in Asia, was the key to global political control. Over the past century and a half, a number of major geopolitical theories have developed in an attempt to both explain world power structures and further empower contemporary global authorities. It is true that many early scholars in the field of geopolitics were attempting to provide context to global political institutions. However, these individuals were also employed, at least in part, by imperial power brokers in the United Kingdom and in the United States. Therefore, their theories had a deeper purpose: to propose strategic plans for global control. Of these scholars, theories from Halford Mackinder, Nicholas Spykman, Emanuel Wallerstein, Alfred Mahan, Samuel Huntington, and Friedrich Ratzel became the dominant models used by the UK, US, and Germany for the purpose of world domination. The Heartland Theory, as proposed by Halford Mackinder, became the dominant geopolitical model in the early 20th century as the UK turned its attention toward control of resources in Central Asia. The Rimland Theory, designed by Nicholas Spykman and built on the earlier Heartland Theory, was used in the mid-20th century to rationalize US involvement in Southeast Asia. The World Systems Theory, proposed by Emanuel Wallerstein, attempted to explain the relationship between developed and developing countries through the control of natural resources. While not formally recognized as a geopolitical theory, it has been used by anti-imperialists to contextualize global spatial inequalities. Alfred Mahan's book, titled The Influence of Sea Power on History, was used by Theodore Roosevelt to design his big stick approach to U.S. foreign policy. This theory, above all others, has been the dominant model for U.S. control in the Pacific Ocean. The Clash of Civilizations theory, first proposed by Samuel Huntington, has been used by the U.S. and UK to explain the threat of sectarian violence and terrorism in the Middle East. This theory has helped to rationalize U.S. involvement in the War on Terror. And finally, the Organic State theory, created by Friedrich Ratzel, argues that the state is a living organism and must grow in order to survive. This model was used by Nazi Germany to rationalize the invasion of the Rhineland and Poland in the late 1930s. Sir Halford Mackinder was an English geographer, academic, and politician who is regarded as one of the founding fathers of both geopolitics and geostrategy. He was also a member of Parliament for Glasgow from 1910 to 1922. After retiring from politics, he went back to academia as a professor of geography at the London School of Economics. In 1904, he published an article titled The Geographical Pivot of History in the Geographical Journal, the official journal of the Royal Geographical Society of England. In this article, Mackinder developed a theory to explain the importance of strategic control over resources in Eurasia. He argued that the Earth's surface could be organized into three main groups: the world island, comprised of the continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa, also called Afro-Eurasia; the offshore islands, including the British Isles and the islands of Japan; and the outlying islands, including the continents of North America, South America, and Oceania. The Heartland is located at the center of the world island, stretching from the Volga to the Yangtze and from the Himalayas to the Arctic. Mackinder's Heartland was the area then ruled by the Russian Empire and later by the Soviet Union. He specifically referred to the Heartland as the pivot area and argued that if a country controlled the pivot area, it controlled the world. The power to control the world island reflected Britain's growing need for resources in order to run its empire overseas. Mackinder argued that whoever controlled these resources would have strategic control over industrialization and militaries abroad. This is especially true when considering the dominant form of land transportation at the time was the railroad. By controlling overland transportation and resources in Eurasia, Britain could control all other countries' access to those resources. In his 1919 book, titled Democratic Ideals and Reality, a study in the politics of Reconstruction, Mackinder claimed, quote, "Who rules East Europe commands the Heartland. Who rules the Heartland commands the world island. Who rules the world island commands the world." Britain would use the Heartland theory to rationalize foreign intervention in South and Central Asia over the next 50 years. The Heartland theory would be adopted by the Trilateral Commission in the 1970s under the leadership of Zbigniew Brzezinski. In his book, The Grand Chessboard, Brzezinski argued that the next big war would take place in Afghanistan, and the U.S. would need to control this region in order to control global political affairs. In order to better understand this theory, we must first place it in an historical context. In the mid-19th century, Russia was expanding into South Asia, a territory that the British needed to control. Thus began the 200-year struggle for control of Afghanistan and Iran. Both Iran and Afghanistan have an abundance of natural resources such as oil, natural gas, precious metals, and opium. However, neither country is located completely within Mackinder's Heartland. These countries were viewed by the British as strategic staging grounds for the real prize, Central Asia. During the latter years of the 19th century and before the publication of Mackinder's Geographical Pivot of History, Russia and Britain were involved in several border skirmishes in northern Persia, now called Iran, and Afghanistan. Most of these conflicts did not occur between British and Russian forces directly, as both countries were training groups of militias to fight their battles for them. While Afghans and Persians were dying on the battlefield, Russian oligarchs and British industrialists were profiting from the resources gained in the conflict. This conflict between Russia and Britain over the control of resources in Persia and Afghanistan was termed by Henry Rawlinson the Great Game. Historians and geographers disagree as to the exact year the Great Game ended, and many scholars argue that it still continues today. But conflict cooled by 1873 when Russia and Britain signed an agreement outlining the borders of Afghanistan and Persia. Subsequent treaties between the British, Afghan, and Persian leaders laid the groundwork for British control of the region. Russia couldn't help but notice the encroaching British forces, so in the early 1880s they annexed portions of Afghanistan. By 1893, direct conflict between the two powers was imminent, and the Kabul Agreement was signed. This agreement defined the borders of Afghanistan and delineated British and Russian spheres of influence. It would be the Great Game that would lead Mackinder to conclude that whoever controls the Heartland controls the world. So the question remains, why did Britain feel the need to stop Russia from expanding into Persia and Afghanistan? In the latter half of the 19th century, it became clear to Britain that Russia's sheer size and military strength represented a growing threat to the British Empire. Britain had spread its resources too thin, and it was becoming more expensive and difficult to control its overseas territory. At the time, the British Empire controlled major portions of the Earth's surface. The saying, "the sun never sets on the Queen," refers to the massive reach of the British Empire during the late 19th century. Queen Victoria controlled overseas territory in every continent across the globe. The Commonwealth had grown to such a large size that the sun quite literally never set on the Queen's dominion. During this period, Afghanistan was the key to stopping Russia from expanding its reach into the British-controlled India. It also came with the benefit of a wealth of natural resources. Controlling Afghanistan was key to the destruction of the Russian Empire and the continuing dominance of the British Empire across the globe. The Heartland Theory now gave the British Crown scholarly rationale for control of these resources. In referring to the goal of controlling the pivot area and warning of the growing power of Russia and Germany, Mackinder stated, quote, "The oversetting of the balance of power in favor of the pivot state, resulting in its expansion over the marginal lands of Eurasia, would permit of the use of vast continental resources for fleet building, and the empire of the world would be in sight. This might happen if Germany were to ally herself with Russia. The threat of such an event should, therefore, throw France into alliance with the overseas powers. And France, Italy, Egypt, India, and Korea would become so many bridgeheads where the outside navies would support armies to compel the pivot allies to deploy land forces and prevent them from concentrating their whole strength in fleet. May not this, in the end, prove to be the strategic function of India in the British imperial system?" To Mackinder, India was the key to the control of the pivot area. At the time of Mackinder's essay, British-controlled India bordered southern Afghanistan, and this region was the key to stopping the growth of the Russian Empire. The broad majority of the American population today can't place Afghanistan on a map, but it's often the places the public knows very little about that are the most important. In fact, the strategic value of an area is often omitted and hidden by the very individuals that stand to gain from the control of these regions. Afghanistan is one of the most important examples of strategic regions that has been covered up by those in power. Most Americans believe the U.S. invaded Afghanistan to respond to the 9/11 attacks. However, the Anglo-American establishment has been involved in Afghanistan since the 1860s. While not dominant players until the second half of the 20th century, U.S. industrialists were heavily involved in the region. During the Great Game, the British Empire was also fighting a war with China for control of the Hong Kong opium trade. The Second Opium War occurred between 1856 and 1860 and resulted in China ceding Hong Kong to Britain. Britain used their powerful navy to take control of opium traffic out of China and ship it to the rest of the world. The opium would also be used to dope the Chinese population into submission. Several prominent American businessmen were involved in the smuggling business as well. According to James Bradley, quote, "A procession of American sea merchants made their fortunes smuggling opium. They were aware of its poisonous effects on the Chinese people, but few of them ever mentioned the drug in the thousands of pages of letters and documents they sent back to America. Robert Bennett Forbes, a Russell and Company contemporary of Delano's, defended his involvement with opium by noting that some of America's best families were involved. Those 10 whom I have always been accustomed to look up as exponents of all that is honorable in trade, the Perkins, the Peabodys, the Russells, and the Lowes." As the supply of opium began to wane in Hong Kong by the end of the 19th century, the British turned their attention to Afghanistan, which was now under its sphere of influence. These same families involved in Hong Kong became major investors of poppy fields in British-controlled Afghanistan. The connections between the British, the United States, and Afghanistan did not end after its independence. British troops remained in portions of southern Afghanistan until the 1970s, when the Soviet Union moved a series of troops near its northern border. The U.S. and Soviet Russia were in the middle of the Cold War, and by 1979, the U.S. would use Afghanistan as a staging ground to finance opposition forces against the Soviets. From 1979 to 1989, the U.S. and the United Kingdom provided money and weapons to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. In fact, a small group of militants were created by the CIA and given the name Al-Qaeda, which roughly translated from Arabic into the base, or shortened form of database. Individuals in this organization were trained by the CIA in covert guerrilla operations against the Soviets. In an address to the House of Commons in the UK, British Foreign Secretary Robin Cook told Parliament, quote, "In the mid-1980s, Al-Qaeda was a database located in a computer and dedicated to the communications of the Islamic Conference's Secretariat." One of the most famous individuals listed in the database was Osama bin Laden. He was trained and supported by the US, the UK, and the royal family of Saudi Arabia throughout the 1980s and 90s. In his speech to Parliament, Robin Cook went on to say, quote, "Al-Qaeda was neither a terrorist group nor Osama bin Laden's personal property. The terrorist actions in Turkey in 2003 were carried out by Turks, and the motives were local and not international, unified, or joint. These crimes put the Turkish government in a difficult position vis-a-vis the British and the Israelis. In the end, those attacks were blamed on Al-Qaeda in Iraq." Throughout the 1980s, the CIA, along with UK intelligence, funded the covert operations of Al-Qaeda through the sale of guns and heroin. Peter Dale Scott, professor emeritus at UC Berkeley, detailed the account of weapon and drug smuggling by U.S. intelligence in Afghanistan in his 2003 book titled Drugs, Oil, and War: The United States in Afghanistan, Colombia, and Indochina. According to Scott, quote, "The CIA contracted for Contra support in Central America with an airline owned by a ringleader of the largest cocaine network in the region. By providing funds for Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, a drug trafficker selected for support by Pakistani intelligence, the CIA helped propel Hekmatyar into becoming, for a while, the largest heroin trafficker in Afghanistan and perhaps the world." Ultimately, the training of Mujahideen fighters and al-Qaeda operatives in Afghanistan proved to be a success, and the Soviet Union pulled out its troops in 1989. After the U.S. left Afghanistan, several individuals from the Mujahideen, formerly allied with the U.S., formed the group known today as the Taliban. The Taliban petitioned the U.S. for financial support several times after troops had left the area. Each time, the U.S. would give a list of demands to the leaders of the Taliban. By 2000, the Taliban had instituted several reforms and began burning thousands of acres of poppy fields. Shortly after September 11, 2001, the U.S. invaded Afghanistan, claiming retribution for the attacks on the World Trade Center towers in New York. Interestingly, the plan to invade Afghanistan had been developed well before the September 11th attack.
The world was told that the invasion, launched after the invocation of NATO's self-defense treaty, was a response to the false flag events of September 11, 2001.
On September the 12th, the North Atlantic Council met again in response to the appalling attacks perpetrated yesterday against the United States of America. The Council agreed that if it is determined that this attack was directed from abroad against the United States, it shall be regarded as an action covered by Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which states that an armed attack against one or more of the allies in Europe or in North America shall be considered an attack against them all.
But this explanation, like the official narrative of the events of 9/11 itself, was a carefully constructed lie. As Professor Michel Chossudovsky of the Center for Research on Globalization explains, the U.S. government's demand for Osama bin Laden's extradition were proven disingenuous when they repeatedly denied the Taliban's offers to extradite him, and the invasion itself, a major theater operation, was launched impossibly quickly.
What happened is that NATO essentially declared war. It was confirmed subsequently, but it declared war on Afghanistan on the grounds that Afghanistan had attacked America through its support of al-Qaeda. It was extremely tenuous, but in a bitter irony, nobody actually questioned the logic of this decision, and that included trade unions, NGOs, and so on. The other element, which I think is very crucial, is that you do not prepare a large-scale theater war thousands of miles away in less than 28 days. That war was prepared before 9/11. And consequently, public opinion was led to believe that this was an act of retribution. Military analysts were mum on the subject. They know the logic and the timing of military projects. Now, the third element, I think, which is very important, is that the Afghan government, which the US refers to as the Taliban, approached the US State Department on 2 occasions and said, if you want to have bin Laden extradited the United States to US justice, we will consider and we will discuss it. And that proposal had been turned down by the Bush administration on the grounds, to quote George W. Bush, "We do not negotiate with terrorists," quote unquote. So that in effect, the Afghan war was already in the pipeline. And I think what is also important is that the war in Afghanistan, under the global war on terrorism, which was launched with the war in Afghanistan, sets the stage for a series of wars under the same mandate of going after the terrorists. So we have, of course, we have Iraq, then we have Libya, we have Syria, we have Yemen, we also have Pakistan, the drone war, and then we have the extension of the global war on terrorism to sub-Saharan Africa, to Southeast Asia.
That the invasion of Afghanistan had been planned well before 9/11 was first revealed by Niaz Naik, the former Foreign Secretary of Pakistan, who told BBC News that he was told by senior American officials in mid-July of 2001 that military action against Afghanistan would go ahead by the middle of October. This story was confirmed by Donald Rumsfeld, who told the September 11th Commission hearings in March of 2004 that the first major national security directive of the Bush administration was a plan to combat the Taliban in Afghanistan. Although it was not officially signed until October 25, 2001, nearly 3 weeks after the invasion began, it was in fact drafted in June of that year and was sitting on the president's desk waiting to be signed on September 4th, 2001, 1 full week before 9/11.
Dr. Rice has stated that she asked the National Security Council staff in her first week in office for a new presidential initiative on al-Qaeda. In early March, the staff was directed to craft a more aggressive strategy aimed at eliminating the al-Qaeda threat. The first draft of that approach in the form of a presidential directive was circulated by the NSC staff in June of 2001, and a number of meetings were held that summer at the Deputy Secretary level to address the policy questions involved, such as relating an aggressive strategy against Taliban to U.S.-Pakistan relations. By the first week of September, the process had arrived at a strategy that was presented to principals and later became NSPD 9, the President's first major substantive national security decision directive. It was presented for a decision by principals on September 4th, 2001, 7 days before the 11th, and later signed by the President with minor changes and a preamble to reflect the events of September 11th in October.
Prior to the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, opium production had declined by 99%. Since the invasion, Afghanistan has become the largest exporter of opium in the world, all while U.S. troops guard the poppy fields.
So here's the question. Why are American troops now helping Afghan farmers grow that opium? Nick Schifrin reports from Afghanistan on a controversial new policy.
In western Kandahar, poppy farmers score, till, harvest their crop, and the Americans do nothing to stop them.
I'll start pushing slow. Assalamu alaikum.
U.S. soldiers greet farmers.
Can you show me which poppy field is yours?
They commiserate with farmers having a bad harvest.
Tell him I'm very sorry for his field this year, and hopefully he has a better harvest next year.
And in one case, they even paid a farmer $1,000 after U.S. and Afghan special forces burned his crop.
If you can come down to the base or on my next visit, I'll make a payment.
This is controversial. The opium trade is the Taliban's main source of funding.
Around here, this poppy isn't only a plant, it's the very basis of the economy here. Poppy grows everywhere in this area, and most of the farmers base their entire income for the entire season on this harvest.
And that's why soldiers ignore and encourage the farmers. If the U.S. burned their crop, farmers would blame the U.S. for their poverty and turn toward the Taliban.
Afghanistan today produces over 90% of the world supply of heroin. And the invasion of Afghanistan occurred at a moment when the Afghan government, together with the United Nations, had implemented a far-reaching drug eradication program. In other words, they were eliminating opium and implementing crop substitution with the support of the UN. They were congratulated in the United Nations General Assembly in fall of 2001. And in fact, what the Taliban government achieved was a more than 90% collapse in opium production recorded in let's say in 2001. Now, immediately upon the influx of US troops and the occupation of Afghanistan, the production of opium sprung up to its historical levels and has increased multiple times since then.
Of course, opium is not the only strategic resource of interest to the U.S. In 2003, geologists discovered nearly $1 trillion worth of untapped mineral deposits throughout Afghanistan. Of that $1 trillion in resource wealth, iron accounts for approximately $420.9 billion of potential profits for U.S. corporations. The fight for control of Afghanistan can trace its roots back to the Heartland Theory, a model specifically designed for the control of Central Eurasia. Conclusions drawn by Torbjorn Knudsen in his 2014 article titled Halford Mackinder, Geopolitics, and the Heartland Thesis sums up this link quite succinctly. Quote, "Few cases show Mackinder's relevance better than the conference held in Bonn in December 2001, which legitimized Western intervention in Afghanistan with a grandiloquent rhetoric of human rights and development that defined absurd goals about a new Afghan state to be run on Western principles of popular sovereignty. A dozen years of costly war shows the continued relevance of Mackinder's warning against indulging in wishful thinking and defying geographic realities." Next time on the Lane Report, we discuss the impact of Nicholas Spykman's Rimland theory on post-World War II geopolitical strategy and the resulting war in Vietnam.